Talking about common denominators today. So common denominator, they're needed when you're adding, subtracting fractions. So that's when you've used it before, but we also use them when we're solving equations algebraically to get rid of fractions. So we would not want to deal with the fractions in this equation because it's much harder to deal with fractions than it is to just get rid of them. So in order to get rid of them, you have to know how to use a common denominator. So that's what today's lesson is, and I'm going to apply it to this in the end when we're done. So how do we find the least common denominator? Well, you can list out all of the multiples of your numbers, and your smallest number that they have in common is the least common denominator. That's the hardest way to do it. That's the most time consuming, and that's the way that I really would prefer not to use because it takes more time. So we're going to use something called the upside down birthday cake method. So let's start with 35 and 14. So I write out the numbers and I make an upside down layer cake. So then I say to myself, what number goes into both of these numbers evenly? Well, 7 goes into both of them. So now I'm going to divide. 35 divided by 7 is 5, and I put the answer down here. And 14 divided by 7 is 2. And I call it an upside down birthday cake because if there was a number that went into both of these evenly, I would make another layer underneath it. But since there's not, I leave it. Now, I'm going to multiply these numbers in an L because least common denominator is an L. So this makes an L. So this is what I multiply. 7 times 5 times 2. And that is 70. So my least common denominator for 35 and 14 is 70. And I could do the same thing with the next one. What is the least common denominator for 18 and 12? Make a layer. What goes into both 18 and 12? Well, 2 goes into both of them. 18 divided by 2 is 9, and 12 divided by 2 is 6. Is there anything that goes into both 9 and 6? Yes, 3 goes into both of them. So I'm going to make another layer to my cake. 3 goes into both of them. 9 divided by 3 is 3, and 6 divided by 3 is 2. And since there's nothing else that goes into 3 and 2, I'm done. Now I multiply these numbers. 2 times 3 times 3 times 2. So that gives me 36. So 36 is my least common denominator for those numbers. Now I have, for the next one, 5, 6, and 8. So I could set up my upside down birthday cake, but I notice that there's no number that goes into 5, 6, and 8. But I do notice that there's a number that 6 and 8 have in common, so I'm just going to deal with those two first. So I'm going to do my layer cake for the 6 and the 8. 2 goes into both of those. 6 divided by 2 is 3, and 8 divided by 2 is 4. Okay, so I'm done with those because there's nothing that goes into 3 and 4. So if I multiply those out, 2 times 3 times 4 is 24, but then I still have that 5 from here. So if I could just multiply those two, 25 times 5, that's not 25, that is 24. There we go. 24 times 5, because that's 4 times 2, which is 12. Okay, 4 times 5 is 20, and that's 120. So the least common denominator for those three numbers is 120. Okay, so why are we doing this? Especially when we're just doing equations now, so that we don't have to solve an equation that has fractions in it. So I'm going to multiply each term by the common denominator. So this common denominator is pretty easy. I can tell just by looking at it. It's 9, because 3 goes into 9 and 9 goes into 9. So I'm going to multiply each term by 9. Okay, so what I'm really doing, I'm going to show you on the side over here, 9 over 1 times 5 over 3. This is what I'm really doing, but when you get good at it, you don't have to write it out this way. So diagonally, I can factor out a 3. 3 divided by 3 is 1, and 9 divided by 3 is 3, and I'm left with 3 times 5, which is 15. So over here, these cancel out, becomes a 3. It's from over here. And 3 times 5 times r is 15r. And then same thing here. The 3 cancels out because 3 divided by 3 is 3. 9 divided by 3 is 3. So that's 3 times 4, which is 12. So plus 12 equals negative. These 9s cancel out, and I'm left with 8. Now this equation is much easier to deal with than the other one. So I'm going to subtract 12 on each side, and that gives me 15r equals negative 20, because I have two negatives, so I add them and my answer is negative. And I divide by 15 on each side, and I'm left with r equals negative 20/15, which is a fraction that I'm not going to divide. If I divided, it would turn into a decimal. but I am going to simplify it. 20 over 15, I'm not going to turn into a mixed number. I don't have to do that. It's an improper fraction, and improper fractions are just fine. So 5 goes into both of them. 20 divided by 5 is 4, and 15 divided by 5 is 3. So I'm going to leave it as r equals negative 4/3. And it makes sense that I ended up with a fraction because I started with fractions. You're not always going to wind up with a whole number when you're solving equations.